Welcome back to the interview series on the socioeconomic consequences of disruptive technologies by Rethinking Economics NL. Today, we'll be focusing on how disruptive technologies are influencing not only the economy, but also our society. And for that, I'm honored to be able to introduce two world-class experts that have had an enormous influence on me. Firstly, with me today is Andrew McAfee, who is the co-founder and co-director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy and a principal research scientist at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He studies how disruptive technologies, digital technologies, are changing the world. Related to this, he has co-authored Race Against the Machine, The Second Machine Age, and Machine Platform Crowd. Beautiful books, I have to say. With Erik Brynjolfsson. And together with Erik Brynjolfsson, he is also the only two people in the world who is both on the Thinkers 50 list for the world's top management thinkers and the Political 50 list of people transforming American politics. His most recent book is More from Less, how the surprising story of how we learn to prosper while using fewer resources and what will happen next, which was published by Scribner in the fall of 2019. Second with me today is Cesar Hidalgo, who is a Chilean Spanish-American scholar known for his contributions in economic complexity, data visualization, and applied artificial intelligence. He currently leads the Center for Collective Learning at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute in ANITI of the University of Toulouse. He is also an honorary professor at the University of Manchester and a visiting professor at Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. In 2010 and 2019, Professor Hidalgo led MIT's Collective Learning Group. Prior to working at MIT, he was a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Professor Hidalgo is also the founder of DataWheel, an award-winning company specializing in the creation of data distribution and visualization systems. He is also the author of three books, Why Information Grows, The Atlas of Economic Complexity, and How Humans Judge Machines, the latter available both recently as a hardcover and for free online. The first question today is for Andy. I was hoping you could tell us more about your thinking on disruptive technologies in the economy. I was especially curious how this changed over the years. So could you tell us more about, in 2011, you co-authored The Race Against the Machine, and in 2016, The Second Machine Age. So what is your thinking in these books, and how has it changed over this period?
Erik and I wrote this little book. It was a pamphlet, really, in 2011. We self-published it on Amazon. It was called, like you said, Race Against the Machine. And we wrote it because we had this, at the time, just kind of a vague idea that we were living through one of these periods of very deep economic change, very deep societal change brought on by a surge of technological progress. And these don't happen very often. The profound ones don't happen very often. I think everybody knows one of those led to the Industrial Revolution. When we finally unlocked all of the energy in the world's fossil fuels, that really did put humanity on a different trajectory. That trajectory kind of continued about a century ago with electrification and the internal combustion engine and another set of technologies that really did change the way that we live. And Erik and I started to come to the conclusion that we were witnessing another one of those surges of technology, this time brought on by digital technology. And if the previous generations of technology let us massively increase the power of our muscles and escape the limitations of muscle power, we think what's going on now in the second machine age is that we're overcoming the limitations of our mental power. We're able to harness so much more computing capability to help us do tough mental things. And I think that basic thesis has held up pretty well. And I'm not even surprised anymore by being surprised. In other words, when I see a headline about some crazy, weird breakthrough in AI, or a drone that gets smaller and smaller with a better and better camera on it and can do crazy things, I'm super impressed by the specific thing. I'm less impressed by the general trend, because I do think that we are in an age of astonishment because of technological progress. And I think those astonishments are going to keep happening to us.
And how has it changed with Machine Platform Crowd, which you released 2 years later? And I think that there are a lot of themes are the same, but what were you different there? And could you also expand a bit more on how this is changing the economy?
Eric and I wrote Machine Platform Crowd because we had this really interesting experience. After we wrote a book called The Second Machine Age, which came out in 2014, we found ourselves having a lot of very interesting conversations with people who run large organizations. And they kept on saying to us some version of, I believe what the story you're telling me. Now, what do I need to do differently? How do I think about running my company, running my organization differently? And Eric and I said, look, we're business school guys. This is what we're supposed to do. So Machine Platform Crowd was kind of an applied book where we tried to bring together some concepts from computer science, some concepts from economics, and say, this is the nature of the change that is coming. If you want to successfully navigate that change, here are some things that you should keep in mind.
And Professor Hidalgo, how does these ideas of Andy relate to your work? And I was especially curious in the context of how humans judge machines, your newest book.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I agree with what Andy has said and has produced in his work. I agree that we're in a age of transformation, but I think my work has been a little bit different in that even though that transformation is there, and I do believe that technology is an important agent of change, geographically, when we look at it, it is very uneven where it happens. And there is that question, therefore, that if technology is this agent of change that is transforming society, and if knowledge in principle is something that can be copied infinitely, or why, is it so unevenly distributed? And why, are these transformative events concentrated in space and they spread so slowly? So a lot of my work has actually focused on like the social implications of technology as well, how technology or knowledge transforms society, but also in trying to understand why it happens in some places and not others, The work on economic complexity in part is a way to kind of like acknowledge that reality by using some math that helps you take the idea of a production function in economics and say, well, instead of thinking that capital and labor are the factors, can we learn the factors directly from the spatial distribution of data? And if we do that, can those learned factors tell us a better story about, why there is geographic unevenness in economic outcomes? And that's a little bit of what we did then. But more recently, I've been now focusing on work on also trying to understand how this technology is being perceived, because through the work that I did in economic complexity first, I engaged in the development of tools, and I created a company, that creates data distribution systems. And I started to go through a different path, and the academic always likes to comment on the world, but building stuff, it's a very different story. And as I started to build stuff, I started also to worry about how people engage with the things that you build. And I started to realize that if people reject the things that you build, not because they're bad or not because they don't work, but sometimes because they have a different perception of reality or they're coming from a different place, you're going to fail anyway. So I became interested in how people perceive technology, what shapes those perceptions. And that started to happen also at a time in which AI was growing and the backlash against AI started to grow. And when that happened, I saw, well, there is a huge gap here because nobody's asking themselves the question, am I even judging this technology fairly? Are we just kind of like bashing on it because it made a mistake? Or are we bashing on it even when it makes less mistakes than humans? And I thought that there was kind of like an intuition that might be happening, but there was no data that we could use to grasp onto that. So that's why we embarked in this, it was almost like a 4-year journey of collecting data. It's more than 80 controlled experiments that we run to write this book and to try to understand, how people perceive technology, with a hope to understand, how they would accept it, how they would adopt it, and then also what these lessons about how we perceive technology tell us about how we perceive larger systems, whether it is, machines that are made of people, like bureaucracies, or, machines that are made of parts, like the ones that we usually tend to think of like machines.
And I want to just highlight that Cesar is homing in on, I think, the two most important questions that we need to get smarter about. The first one is exactly what he was just talking about. How do people judge machines, technologies, the systems, the tools that are presented to them? Because like we see, that judging does not always go as smoothly as we would like. I look at vaccine resistance in America and many countries around the world. And if we don't convince people of the factually correct things. These are incredibly important. These are incredibly safe. These are huge lifesavers. If we don't learn how to do that, we have a dire, dire problem. If we don't learn how to present powerful technologies like AI in a way that works for the people who will be using AI, be subject to AI's decisions, then we have a problem again. And we can get to some very, very uncomfortable, unpleasant places as societies if we don't do a good job of presenting these tools, even if they're amazingly beneficial tools, in a way that gets them accepted. It's a deep challenge. And the other one that he talked about, which I couldn't agree more with, is that technology is incredibly widely available. The places in the world that are harnessing that technology, that are creating value from it, that are creating the companies that are so profoundly important in the world today, those are not evenly distributed. Those are very, very, very spiky. As I look at the evidence, they're getting spikier instead of more distributed over time. And there are reasons to worry about that. And so we better get insight on these two questions.
So how do you see that? And I was especially curious on that from the complexity economics perspective.
Well, so on the one hand, like knowledge is the thing that is hard to copy, and we've learned that like knowledge is heavy, and it moves as people move and they form social networks. And those are very slow processes. I've just moved to Europe. I'm starting to get to know people. Maybe in 5 or 6 or 10 years, I'm going to have an impact here. And it might be small. I'm just one person, moving to a new place. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, what we have is that technologies in some way have this property that they're labor saving. That's a little bit of kind of like the basics of technology. Yeah. Like why do you want technology? Because you can jump faster, you can lift things that are heavier, and more, it's about saving time. It's about kind of like being able to do more with less, as Andy puts in the title of his book. Now when that happens, because technologies are scalable, it means also that even though they're a source of wealth, they must be also a source of inequality, because they allow few people to serve many. And if we take a more anthropological definition of money, money is just like a unit of favors that are exchanged. So how many favors do I owe you or you owe me? That's how much money like you save or you have. And in that context, some people can make many people a favor. So Google is making many people the favor of like, hey, you want to find something on the internet? Come to my little box. You can do it. I do that favor for you. And then there's tons of people that are paying to show their stuff on that box to them. And they have a super scalable business model that would have been impossible in the era of the newspapers, or that would have been impossible in other communication technologies. So that also puts us kind of like in this very awkward position in which knowledge is growing. The ability to accumulate knowledge in an applied setting, like to create products, it's very spiky. It concentrates, not only because of knowledge diffusion problems, also because of economic problems. It's hard to compete also. Even if you can figure out how to do it, it's going to be very hard to kind of like get market share and grow and keep on hiring people and convincing advertisers. Let's say if you're a search engine, to advertise with DuckDuckGo, not with Google, that is already dominant in the market. And as that happens, you start kind of like getting, like these forces that push inequality. And I think that brings us to the other question, which is people start having very different outcomes. They don't see technology as this thing that is here to kind of like save time, save effort, and make the world richer. They see it as something that a few people get to control and that benefits them. And I think there's some reason to see that. And in that context also, they start to become a skeptic about it because their place in the world is not that great, they're in a situation that is difficult. And in that context, I think we get all of this skepticism, where it is that, is Bill Gates is trying to put a chip through the vaccine, and all of this idiocy. I think they come through places of discomfort that at the same time are created by these technologies that are here to make the world better, but for which is very difficult to spread those benefits in a way that at least would be considered fair by many people, and I think that's kind of like the tension, that technology itself creates the inequality that limits its own adoption, that creates a society that wants to reject it, and that's sort of like a very interesting, vicious circle that we have here.
Now, this is really interesting because I get to disagree with Cesar a little bit here.
Okay.
I agree with a lot of, Cesar, what you just said. And there are dimensions of inequality that are clearly increasing in many parts of the world. And they're clearly really, really important. You and I would both agree wealth and income inequality is something we should keep our eyes on. And it's a challenge. There are other really important dimensions of inequality that are collapsing around the world, and where the fortunate and the people at the base of the pyramid are actually coming closer together in a way that we've never seen before. My favorite examples of this are health inequality. So if you look at some of the things that we care about most around the world with health, if you look at child mortality or maternal mortality or access to drinking water, we have never, ever seen a greater convergence of those outcomes than we are seeing right now around the world. I graph some of this in More from Less. And I have trouble thinking about any global inequality that's more important than health inequality. And that inequality is collapsing around the world. Going along with that, this unease with technology that Cesar was doing such a great job of describing, I think this is largely a rich world phenomenon. I think it is largely a phenomenon of people who were used to be in the middle class in the rich world, who are correctly seeing some real challenges to their livelihoods. I think the elite conversation in the rich world that Cesar and I are both lucky enough to be part of, in general, that is a sharply negative conversation. If you go ask people, I would say almost anywhere in the bottom half of the global income range, what do you think of technology? They will say, it's fantastic. Please, we want more as quickly as we can possibly get it. So I don't want these discussions about the negative consequences are important. I think on a global basis, they're actually kind of narrow.
Yeah, so let me agree and disagree a little bit too. So good. I agree, that there are important forms of inequality that are being reduced, and the ability that we've had to generate, growth and wealth to get people out of poverty over the last 20, 30 years is remarkable. So I agree with you and with Max Roser and with Steve Pinker and with Hans Rosling. And I'm a big believer also, part of my research has focused so much in growth, because I also believe that it's not just about distribution. It's about that economic growth that comes from technology that lifts people up. But at the same time, I engage a little bit with the psychology of the phenomena. And I see it, both in rich and in poor countries, just to give you an example of a rich country example of, people being narrow-minded. A very good friend and colleague of mine, a few days ago, actually, comes to me when I was in the US packing with a box that he wanted me to bring to Europe, for someone, and I said, put it on the mail. Well, this person, mid-30s, American, very towny type, didn't know that USPS sent packages outside the US because it is USPS, it's for the US. So you can have kind of like that narrow-mindedness depending on how much you've seen of the world. And I think the point I'm trying to make there is that the perception that people is going to have depends on the opportunities that they had. So maybe 30, 40 years ago, I would agree with you that the condition for many people was worse, but their ability to be aware of what was going on in different parts was also diminished. And as those conditions improved, for instance, the social phenomena that we've seen in Chile a lot, recently, and the social protest and the eruption, it was, it could be told as, people in extreme poverty, but in reality, a big part of the social phenomena was people that were first generations, that they went to the university. They told them this idea that, well, if you work hard, you educate yourself, you are not going to be like the previous generation. And they find themselves, graduating from college, having jobs that don't pay better or in comparison, and a very difficult, life with a lot of competition of people in a similar situation. But they're much more aware of, the world. They're much more educated. They have ability to understand things. So I do think that those two things, in a way, counterbalance each other, because as the world gets better, but also as our perceptions get wider, you're able to kind of like see things in which you're going to perceive forms of inequality that before were invisible to you because you didn't leave the town, you didn't leave the village, you didn't know that USPS, mailed abroad. So I agree with you on the fact, but I do think that the perception has a component in which, that runs in the opposite direction as people become more aware, even in the less developed countries, they also start seeing kind of, the systemic difference that sometimes they were invisible to them. And it's a reality that is more complex and difficult to accept sometimes.
I was also very curious for you, Andy, basically on how you see that, but also in relation to some other trends and basically graphs we're seeing. So, for instance, Piketty's work, of course, basically on the increase in income inequality, but also the decoupling that we're seeing of productivity and wage growth since the 1980s. How are you seeing that then in the context of these technologies?
There's a huge amount of debate among the smartest economists that I follow and that I try to learn from about exactly how pronounced those phenomena are. Everybody who I follow agrees that inequality has been rising in most countries. America is a clear example. Most people agree that there has been a divergence between productivity and pay, at least in America, for some kinds of workers. And it's pretty clear that more of the income is going up to the top. I forget if it's the top, 10 or 20 or 25% of earners, but in general, there's kind of a group that's doing fine and pulling away, and another group that's holding steady or in some cases even falling behind. These are absolutely things that we need to worry about. I'm even more worried about what Cesar talked about first. The geographic distribution of our economy is changing. It's changing in the direction of concentration. And I have trouble telling a happy story where a bigger and bigger percentage of the GDP of America or the Netherlands comes from a smaller and smaller number of hectares. That there's a problem with that for the very simple reason that there are people living on those pieces of land that are getting left behind, that are not economically viable anymore. And Cesar and I both know that as a rule, economists are not, they don't lack confidence. They think they have a very good toolkit to analyze problems. They think they have a good toolkit to address problems. When it comes to this problem of increasing geographic inequality in economic activity, most of the honest economists I know say our toolkit, the things that we know work, our toolkit is not very good for addressing that problem. And figuring out what to do about that and spreading back out the economic growth, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of activity. While all that's going on, our economy just gets spikier and spikier.
So let me add something to that. So I've been advocating for the last 15 years and working on trying to get economies that are less developed to go into knowledge-intense sectors. The product space is like, well, what's the best way to climb that complexity ladder? Economic complexity is about like, well, what is the knowledge intensity of your economy and how you can measure it and so forth. But during that time also, I became an entrepreneur. I have a company with 26 people and so forth. And I must admit that a lot of the lessons that I learned about, business and economics, I learned it by being a CEO and a manager, and this is a lesson that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is, I think, very important. This lesson is about the fact that knowledge-intense economies can be very cruel. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So let's say you have a relatively not knowledge-intense sector, like a fruit packing plant. Okay, so there's a conveyor belt, there are boxes, there's peaches, the peaches need to be put into boxes, they need to be checked and so forth. And you have many people that are putting peaches in boxes. Now, what's the marginal cost of training someone to become part of that job, to including someone? So think of it now from the point of inclusion. So someone comes in or there is a surge in demand and you need to bring someone else into the line. And sure, there might be some protocols of safety and hygiene that need to be performed, but you can probably have a person, working on that assembly line, maybe within a week, maybe within a day, Now, I run a software company in which we have a stack of software that we've developed over 8 years that is extremely, complex, and it has its own flavor of language. When we hire people, it takes us 3 to 6 months for these people to be able to commit code. It always has to be reviewed by others. And the problem that I face as a manager is that there are, for example, guys that are good developers, but that they hate teaching others. And when the new people come in, they say, this guy is bothering me. I don't want to explain him how the stuff works. I'm getting frustrated because I have to correct their work. And a big source of stress and tension in the company is that we need to hire people, but the ones that are in, they don't want to spend time teaching them. And if nobody teaches them, even though these guys come with a master's or with a 6-year degree and they know how to program, they're not going to be able to be productive. So the knowledge intense sectors, they have that problem in which it's much costlier to add someone to an operation, and it becomes very cruel because you can have operations that are very scalable. Instagram, had, like 13, 14 people at the moment that they were already like a large company serving, like millions and millions of users. But because of that, I find also a lot of friends of mine from college, that went to college with me and, they were not as lucky as I was, struggling to join the labor market, even though they're highly educated and highly good, because the cutoff is really high. Because in this sector, when you're having someone, let's say that was want to be in charge of kind of like this database or the front end of this platform, whatever, is not as easy to integrate someone as putting peaches on boxes on the conveyor belt. So what I think it's happening right now is that we're moving to these knowledge intense sectors, to these cultural activities, but these cultural activities have inherently this problem of onboarding. It's extremely costly onboarding. And that also, generates another form of, like rejection or displacement or lack of inclusion that we need to worry about, because I think it's structural. The more that we move to a knowledge intense sector, the higher the cost of onboarding, the more that, onboarding causes stress, and that people that are looking for a place might not be included, So in other words, it seems that there's some good things about knowledge intense sector, but there's some things that, for example, we might have had in manufacturing, in terms of inclusion, that are really hard to replicate in this more knowledge intense economy.
Andy, especially considering your work on these type of enterprises, how do you see this?
Which aspect of it?
Well, especially basically on like digital disruptive companies that are really working like this the high intensity knowledge sector.
I completely agree with what Cesar just said. For several decades after the end of World War II, our economies had a bottomless thirst for unskilled labor. And when I say unskilled, what I basically mean is not formally educated beyond a high level. And those jobs, because they were relatively high productivity jobs on assembly lines and things like that, they could provide an unskilled person with a middle class income, and the hope that their kids could become more educated, get higher skills, climb up the ladder that way. Those jobs, they still exist, but they're not as plentiful anymore because of these two huge forces of tech progress and globalization. So the middle class in the rich world is absolutely feeling squeezed and has been left out of a lot of the economic gains that have happened up the education ladder and even somewhat down the education ladder. And we should not pretend that that's not the case.
And to ask you a quick follow-up on that, how do you think that we can create a more inclusive society, so to say, where we can, this technology that we're describing, that it's to some extent creating this inequality, can actually help with alleviating this inequality?
The first person that won the Nobel Prize in economics was a countryman of yours. His name was Jan Tinbergen. And one of his great quotes was that inequality is a race between technology and education. Technology, like we've been talking about, tends to increase inequality, all other things being equal. The great leveler is to give people more skills. And over time, we have done, the average skill level has gone up in most countries around the world. If that is not working really well, my first solution is to re-examine how we're educating people and do better at it. The one line that I'd like to use all the time is that we're doing a great job of educating the kind of workers we needed 75 years ago. Okay, well, let's stop doing that. It's a more knowledge-intensive economy. We need very different skills. We have some idea what those skills are. In addition, we're seeing a lot of innovation in educational approaches. Cesar, you know about things like 42, the school in France, like Lambda, where you share someone's income after they graduate with technical skills. I love these ideas. I don't know if all of them are going to work, but by all means, let's innovate on how we actually deliver skills to people. Can we do it more quickly? Can we do it from a lower base? Do we have to go through the classic educational path that we built up in the rich world in the post-war decades? Well, no, we don't. Let's go figure out what works and do more of that.
Cesar, how are you seeing these things? And I was also curious on, especially for economics students, what you think, what are the type of skills that they should get? And especially in the context of the topics we're discussing today, like disruptive technologies.
Yeah, so let me address the first part of the question, which is, okay, so we have like these forces that are pushing inequality, like what to do about it? And I agree with Andy that, education is important and should be promoted. But I do think that there are forces here at play that are extremely strong and in some way, invite us to think more creatively in two directions. The first one is that during the last, century, and especially during the last 30, 40 years, we have been able to create solutions and business and technologies that are so scalable that they can serve billions with teams that are relatively small, that in that world, expecting that everyone can be included, in the production side of the economy, might be naive, but at the same time, there might be a lot of value of keeping people engaged on the consumption side of the economy. So if you have a homeless person in the US, which is a huge problem in many parts, I would argue that giving that person a UBI and having them be a consumer in the economy is better than having that person have no consumption power, and be, more of a burden on the system, be a person that kind of like gets disease, that, it needs to be visited by social workers, that it's in bad conditions and so forth. So I see more and more that as society progresses, we might have to not achieve equality through some sort of redistribution system. I'm very capitalistic in many ways, and I do believe that giving people the ability to own the fruits of what they produce and reinvest them, it's a really important freedom that needs to be protected. But I do think that you need to, in some way, ensure parts of society, from the ultimate ruin, because the problem is that that's in a society that you don't have, like good ways to stop that ruin from happening, that becomes an attractor. It's not a place that people bounce off from, Once you have like no friends and you're in the street, nobody wants to even talk to you, like you're smelly and you look like someone that is scary. So you need to protect people from that ruin. So I do believe, that things like UBI and so forth are going to have to be part of the solution, and that the economy lives on the excess, it lives on top of that, because nobody wants to be there. And the ones that wants to be there, well, let them be there, but let them be there with some dignity, and I think that's kind of like an important thing that we're going to like look at this century. I think that is going to become more and more a discussion. And I think we're going to see that happening when we exit COVID, because when COVID happened, the economy was hit, but it was hit very differentially. Like, I'm sure that Andy has done great. I've been doing, well, but there's, I live here next to a plaza, the Plaza San Jorge, full of restaurants that all closed except two, and there's a lot of people that are having a very different reality right now, but we're not talking to them. And at some point, the COVID, confinement hopefully is going to end. People are going to start mixing again, and we're going to realize that the wedge between society grew even further. And there's a lot of people that had a very different experience of what 2020 and 2021 meant to them. And that pressure, I think, is gonna affect politics in a way that it cannot do right now, because people cannot congregate, because people cannot express themselves in the way that they can in a non-confinement state. So that's a little bit how I see it. I do see it as a more progressive form of Keynesianism that we're going to need to adopt. I do think that there is a world in which our supply side can be so strong that the information that people reveal through the acts of consumption, it's enough to justify a minimum level of consumption that you want to give them. Because when people consume, they inform you about what needs to be produced, what is liked, and so forth. Well, that is something that I do think we're going to get to a point in which we're going to be so rich that the value of knowing what needs to be done or who likes what is going to be enough to justify a very basic income.
So I'd love to come back as well to the education aspect. But first, Andy, how do you see this?
A bit differently than Cesar does. And I still hear a line from Erik, from Brynjolfsson, from my co-author, and he always says, does anyone think right now that there's a shortage of work that needs to be done? And to follow up on that, does anyone seriously think that there's a shortage of work that can only be done by human beings, where we don't have robots and AI that can do the work? And when I hear Erik phrase it that way, it becomes incredibly clear to me the problem that we face is not a shortage of useful, societally beneficial work for human beings to do. We're in a very strange period right now because of the pandemic, where we literally cannot be close to each other because there's this deadly disease going around. Great, we're going to get past that. Let's all assume that the vaccines appear to work spectacularly well. So we're going to get back to a more normal economy. In that normal economy, is there any shortage of work that needs to be done? I think about the energy transition that we have to get through, and that we have to get through very quickly. And I think about the jobs that would come if we were intelligent about that. I think of the poor job that we do in America of taking care of some of our most vulnerable populations and the work that could come out of that. So I am not worried about not having enough work to go around and therefore needing a universal basic income. I'm worried about creating the right conditions so that people can get matched to the jobs and the work that need to be done and be part of that world of work, which I believe is actually incredibly important for a person's dignity and sense of community and sense of belonging.
Ask you a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that everyone is able to do those jobs? Because I can imagine that although we're seeing that far more people are getting a university education and such, I can imagine that AI is also to some extent creating more upper level and lower level jobs. So do you think that that's an issue, or that it's not an issue at all?
It's an issue, but think about jobs again that AI and that robots are nowhere near doing, nowhere near. Caring for a room of 12 children. You think an AI is going to do that anytime soon without terrifying the children? Absolutely not. Fixing a bridge that's in need of repair. I assure you, we have no robots anywhere near deployment that can do that. Installing a wind farm or a solar farm. We simply don't have technologies that can do that. This is why I say that there's no shortage of work that needs to be done. And maybe in the crazy, distant sci-fi future, maybe you will live to see an economy that is incredibly productive and just doesn't need a lot of human labor as an input. I think that's plausible at some point in the future. That is not where we are now. It's not where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years.
I would agree that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, maybe for 3 billion people. I don't know if there's going to be like for 7. So I do think that there is kind of like, I don't disagree that there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done and that cannot be automated. I also see that there's a lot of people, and that at the bottom, getting hired, it's really hard, even at an okay wage with a high level of education. What I see right now, like shuffling, even like, for example, in the software sector that lends itself to telecommuting, it's, like a big flight towards, like middle and lower income countries that have, good educational systems, but you can get an engineer for $2,000 a month instead of, $150,000 a year. And even in that space, as people get educated, like the salaries, are quite depressed, and it's easy to find people, So like, at least the problem that I have is I have way more people that want to work with me or that want to do something that I can get to hire, given the resources that are flowing through me at the moment. And I see kind of like that scramble, So I agree that there's a lot of work to be done. I do think that there might be a differential, and in that differential, is where frustration is gonna grow. It's because it's not. people that didn't try or didn't want to or didn't work hard. Like frustration comes from those that try and they didn't get the opportunities. I'm afraid that at least my intuition is that there's going to be an important difference there, like a big enough gap to become, a problem.
And to return also to something we were discussing earlier, the education aspect. So it seems that many of the topics we discuss today are in the economics education, but quite a few aren't. So how do you think that we should include these aspects? For instance, complexity economics. So how do you see that? Should we include that, the economics education, in what ways?
Economics education, or are you talking about education in society more in general?
I think it's most interesting to first focus on the education specifically for economists.
Education for economists. So I do think that, I make some like general distinctions to kind of like help place different fields of thought within a context. On the one hand, there is a big difference to me between the social science, and the natural sciences in the objects of study, which is the following. You can go all of your life without knowing, how quarks work, and knowing nothing about nuclear physics. And most people can go all of their lives, without engaging with any of that. And natural sciences has a lot of that, when you look at cell biology, genetics, astrophysics, but in the social sciences, we deal with things that people that are professionally trained or not have to deal with. Everybody participates of the economy and they see that there are periods that are better, that are worse, whether they have an understanding based on models or in empirically verified facts or just the stories of their grandpa is a different story. But, there are fields, that in some way participate on things that everybody kind of has an opinion on, while nobody has, or very few people have an opinion on quarks, a lot of people have an opinion on the economy for sure. And the other field is ethics, whether you are a professional philosopher trained on ethics or you are a normal person, you have been asking yourself questions about, is it right or wrong to do this all your life, And, there are intuitions that are formed around it. So in that context, the fields that deal, in these spaces in which the non-experts are always going to have an opinion, I think that in an uncomfortable position, of course, because they're always going to kind of like get non-expert input, but at the same time, they have kind of like a responsibility to engage with these different, schools of thoughts and ideas of other people that have been thinking about that from a different perspective, And you think about it, like the social sciences is all built kind of like on verticals of different models of what matters about the world, like economics and political science. You can think, well, in economics, we try to think about the world as a collection of rational agents. In political science, we try to think about the world as battles of power between individuals, but you can all have micro, meso, and macro in both of them, because you kind of like subscribe to maybe different ways to think about human behavior and collective behavior, but the object of study has a big overlap and has, inputs that are shared. So that's why there's also kind of like all these cross. There's people that go from economics to talk about institutions, and there's people that come from political science to say how like institutions are affecting the economy and whatnot. So I think in that context, it is important to stop the identity academics that we now suffer, in which there is this shared subject, which is society. There are all of these approaches to look at it from academia. And there's all of these people also outside academia that in some way they have a valid lived experience from where there can be insight, there can be wisdom that we can draw on, and how can we, make sure that we continue advancing knowledge in the best possible way without using our quest for the search of knowledge as a signaling mechanism to try to tell to others to which academic community we belong or we identify with. And I think that to me is kind of like the big challenge, because in the social sciences, it's much more of that kind of like positioning that within a larger topic, people kind of like try to signal that they belong to a community, while in the natural sciences, maybe because, we are in a topic that, hey, if we're not studying it, nobody else would. Nobody's thinking about this stuff on their day-to-day. It's like stuff that had to be discovered by like, smashing atoms together sometimes. Then there is kind of like more of a fixation on the object of study, no matter the perspective, than on the perspective, itself.
And for Andy, basically, I was very curious in your take on this, but also especially basically what I think it also is that basically the different disciplines have to combine it and such that a lot of economists will be not that familiar with disruptive technologies, and they will have you'll get like a basic understanding in your education, but it will not focus on it like really what will be the effects, basically what are the AI scientists saying and such. So what should they know about that, and how do you see it in the education?
I'm actually not a formally educated economist, so I'm not going to opine on the education over there. What I can say, though, is the economics papers that I read, I find absolutely fascinating. And the methods in the discipline have changed just in the time that I've been following the literature. The empirical toolkit has gotten a lot bigger to investigate questions. The scope of the discipline has increased a lot. And I read a lot of, fascinating stuff about the economics of crime or about algorithmic bias and fairness. These are really important questions. And I think the discipline overall is doing an admirable job of tackling them.
Cesar, are you seeing this?
Second?
So how are you seeing this?
No, yeah, I do think like in economics you find like amazing work and amazing people. So that's no doubt. You do find that a lot. But going back to kind of like your original question, if we think about also the disciplines not in terms of kind of like the model of human nature that they subscribe to, economics, whether we want it or not, is kind of connected a little bit to money, and money, whether you want it or not, is a technology. So in some sense, it is a field that is defined by the study of a technology, if you look at it from that foundational concept, So I do think that the study of technology and economics are intertwined, from the beginning, since money is a technology. And in some sense, that's, I think, maybe why economics has been a successful field from which to study the effects of technology in society, at least, when it relates to like productive activities.
And what do you think will be most important for economists to know about the currently disruptive technologies as AI?
I think they need to learn how to use some of these methods themselves. Some of the coolest papers that I see have combined more traditional techniques with machine learning to go poke at the things that economists are interested in. So, economics is a really expanding discipline. The toolkit is getting bigger. That makes Cesar's point more relevant. Training up to become a first-rate economist, this is actually a long, really intense discipleship to get your arms around the tools. So it's going to take time, and it's going to not be open to everybody. Now, we can all benefit from knowing a little bit of basic economics, but professional economist is kind of daunting these days, I think.
Yeah, I think that further in this series, we'll also have an interview with a group of basic computer scientists that are really applying the methods of economics, of reverse game theory, to really find basically how to build markets and such. So I think that basically listeners that are, or viewers that are interested in this, they will get a bit of an idea on that. Cesar, how you see
this? I agree with Andy, and the way that I see this is that math is not science, and that's a good thing. And the reason that that's a good thing is that mathematical methods usually, tend to play the field, they go around, So the idea of, like dynamical equations, for instance, which, it was very popular, in classical physics, and that's how you solve systems of dynamics and kinematics. Then, was adopted in economics and models of economic growth, and coupled differential equations and so forth. Then, statistics, made it into economics. And I think over the last 20, 30 years, this empirical revolution has been a statistics revolution, that has been very important. But I do think that machine learning is something that's going to contribute to a change too, because it provides a lot of tools that are very interesting to look in particularly at macro problems. Like machine learning excels when there's a lot of data, and you're trying to understand macro phenomena, and you're trying to predict and look at trends and so forth. The work that I've done, one way that I communicated, for example, if I'm talking with computer scientists, is like, hey, what I've been doing is applying machine learning method to understand the economy at the macro scale. The product space is a recommender system, and economic complexity is dimensionality reduction applied, to specialization matrices. These are tools from machine learning that when we apply to economics, they also work, and they should, because that's the nice thing about math, that, dynamical systems, they work in physics, they work in chemistry, they work in ecology, and they work in economics. And by the same token, we should find machine learning tools to be useful in all of these domains. So I do think that there is an opportunity now to expand, the way that we look at economics, or to answer some of the same problems through a different perspective, and maybe even discover some new problems by using this new toolbox that machine learning and AI are bringing to the table.
So considering time, we have about 5 minutes left. I think we have to move towards the closing question, and we do have then quite a few minutes for the answers there. And we always have the same one in this series, and that is, if there's one thing you could say for students of economics watching today, what would that be? And I think it makes most sense to do it in the order of the first questions as well. So first for Andy.
Go investigate real world problems, right? We have the discipline of economics has a really important way of looking at the world and a way of thinking through questions. The mathematical, the statistical toolkit, the technological toolkit for investigating those questions is getting better. The data available are getting better and richer all the time. Go work on an actual question that somebody out there cares about, and spin up on all the latest methods, all the latest and greatest papers that have been written to serve as a model for how you should go about doing that work.
And do you have any recommendations how to best find the real world problems to tackle?
No, I have no idea how to do that. Just I've stumbled across mine by luck, it feels to me all the time.
I think that's the same for me. Cesar, what is for you basically the one thing, if you could say one thing to students in economics watching today, what would that be?
I would say, be nice. And the reason for that is that if you want to engage in a creative environment, you have to let bad ideas grow, mix, mutate to the point that sometimes bad ideas become good ideas. So one thing that I did learn, like at a place like the Media Lab that work in this intersection between technology and the arts, was that some of the most successful entrepreneurs that I met, and these were people that made it big. They made, like video games that sold, millions of copies, and they were loaded. They were, some of the least rational people that I met, and some of the most emotional people that I met. And they were kind of like, I want to do something that made people feel like this. And they would come up with like a lot of weird, bad ideas. But once in a while, when they would get a good one, it would resonate with people, and they would be able to execute it with that finesse, that artists have, that allows them to do things that enjoy wide adoption, acceptance, and they develop fans. At the end, like the consumers of a product, if they're fans, it's fantastic. So that's usually what you want. And I realized to kind of like think a little bit differently. I come from the natural sciences, which are very analytical. I think that makes me similar to economists. We tend to be very critical, and try to sort of like find the holes on the problems and argue them. But I realized that a lot of what we like in the world and what we study when we study the economy comes from a very different breed of people, that are creative because they live in this environment, that is emotional, they're nice to each other, and they let kind of like bad ideas have sex until they have good children. And that's something that I think is important for creativity and when you manage teams in particular, because a lot of the times, like you may cut the wings, too early if you are too critical when things are not yet fully formed, and they can surprise you if you let them grow to their next stage. So be nice.
I think basically the combination of to pursue your crazy ideas, but to be kind to people is a beautiful way to end today's interview. So I want to thank both of you profoundly for your time. It was a beautiful interview, and we look forward to having all the viewers again here next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
thanks, Andrew. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
Always good, my friend. I've got to run. Thanks for including me.
Thank you.
Have fun there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.